Just a second, one last detail. There we go. That's so posterity will be able to hear us. Thank you for coming today and joining me in avoiding this strange thing outside called the sun. It's the wrong setting for it. And it's a pleasure to be part of this series on political partisanship and what's going on in our country and other parts of the world as well. I guess what I'd like to do to start, what I really should do to start though is to mention that you can do it. No, we'll try this. We're not moving at all. For some reason that works. Okay. I do want to mention that I'm actually putting two projects together in this talk. The first project is one in prep that I have with Clint McKenna over there. And any hard questions, we will, of course, refer to Clint. The second project is one that I published with my last graduate student at Cornell, Carmen Sanchez, who's currently at the business school, Geis Business School at the University of Illinois. And the topic is partisan division and polarization. And I'm surprised so far in this series, no one has shown this graphic. So I'm going to show it just for background. And this is basically Pew data through the years that if you survey Democrats and Republicans, how much more uniformly conservative or liberal they are in the positions that they're taking. That is, in the world that I grew up in, everybody politically, at least I knew, was in the mass middle. That's much less so the case now. And even though this graphic ends in 2017, nothing has really changed in terms of increasing polarization politically. But also, and I assume everybody in the audience is familiar with this, partisanship has taken on a different cast, which is much more of a negative one. Namely, if you take a look at between 1994 and 2014, the number, of Democrats who see the Republican Party as a threat to the national well-being, and the percentage of Republicans who see the Democratic Party as a threat to the nation's well-being has really grown. That is, not only has partisanship grown in terms of its magnitude, it's also changed in terms of its quality. It's much more negative, it's much more adversarial than it used to be. Naturally, there's an ongoing debate about how divisive things have really gotten. And are we talking about the everyday person, or are we talking about elites and so forth? But things are different from where they were in 1994. What I want to focus in on today, though, is that the disagreements that one sees are not only one of opinion, but they also increasingly seem to be one about claims regarding fact. That is, if you take a look at what people say about facts on the ground, you tend to see differences in terms of how Democrats and Republicans, liberals versus conservatives, what they actually think is going on in the country. Now, what I have here are four statements that come from 2014. This is data that we collected in our own lab. And basically what we did is we did a survey where we asked people, about 380 people, roughly around the time of the 2014 midterm elections, some factual questions and whether or not these statements about the Obama administration or about the Social Security Trust Fund, whether they were true or false. Now, this is just a selection of the facts we asked people to talk about. There were 16 in total. Half of the facts were congenial to a conservative point of view. Half of the facts were congenial to a liberal point of view. And we just simply looked at how often did people endorse these facts as facts out of the 16. And if you take a look, it's not a surprise that conservatives were more likely to endorse conservative-friendly facts as true than did liberals. And liberals were more likely to endorse as true facts that were more liberal-leaning than did conservatives. What's interesting to us was that how many of the facts that people endorsed were actually true versus actually false. And if you take a look, each side tended to endorse facts that were friendly to it, whether or not those underlying facts were true or false. Now, there's a long history of this in political science work showing that people do tend to endorse facts that are in the favor of their political preferences. Nothing has changed. If anything, things have gotten more extreme in terms of that. And once again, there's a hefty debate going on as to whether or not endorsing these facts really represents true belief, or things made up on the spot, or things that people say that really don't represent anything underneath. But we'll talk about that later. What I'm interested in is the following. In terms of divisiveness, in terms of endorsements of facts on the ground, what is interesting is that in our times, there are a lot of times there are people endorse facts that are fantastical, that can't be true, and certainly carry some animosity to them. For example, if you survey Republicans and Democrats, and by the way, these are data that come from a survey that we did circa 2018. This is not a nationally representative sample. Though what I'm surprised by is these figures pretty much match what you get in a nationally representative sample. In fact, the results we got almost mapped onto the results that were in the survey that we took these statements from. What you find is that Republicans know things or endorse things that certainly put Republicans in a much better light than Democrats. So for example, in our data, almost 60% of Republicans endorsed the idea of the 2016 election, that millions of illegal votes were cast in the most recent presidential election, only 21% of Democrats believe. Or if you take a look at leaked emails from Hillary Clinton's campaign staffers contain code words for pedophilia, human trafficking, and satanic ritual abuse, almost a third of Republicans endorsed that yes, only 15% of Democrats endorsed that yes. If you take a look at the Democratic side and ask people, did Russia, the 2016 election, tamper with election day vote tallies in order to get Donald Trump elected president? The way this was worded, did they actually tamper things on election day? 60% of Democrats said yes, only 5% of Republicans agreed. And when asked whether President Bush knew about the 9/11 attacks before they happened, a third of Democrats said yes, almost twice as many Democrats as Republicans saying yes, we're endorsing that as being true. That is, and I bring this up because this is ultimately the destination that I want to get to. I want to take a look at the psychology behind people endorsing not only facts that represent claims that differ from the other political side, they also represent things that are rather extreme, rather divisive, and rather fantastical. How do we get here? Or rather, who gets there or who gets here in terms of endorsing facts that one could label as conspiratorial? Well, let's get there. I want to take the long way around. Sort of how do people come to endorse facts that favor their political side and put the other political side in a terrible, terrible way? Well, let's begin by talking about how people respond to scientific facts, or rather scientific evidence. When people are looking at scientific data, do they interpret things in an impartial way, or do they tend to bias their interpretation of the conclusions they reach in such a way that favors their side and disfavors the other side? Now, the issue that I want to take a look at closely is gun control. And what we want to do in a series of studies, this is the work that Clint and I have done, is we've presented people numerical data and see how they interpret that numerical data and what sort of conclusions do they reach, and how much is their political distortion in terms of the conclusion they reach. Now, what we do, and I don't know my audience, so I don't, how many of you have seen this before? Very few. Even the psychologist, okay, what I'm about to present you, and this might be too much of an inside joke, is what the trolley problem is to moral reasoning. This is the problem for motivated reasoning. That is basically what we did. And actually, dozens and dozens of researchers have done this in a lot of different types of topics, is they've actually presented subjects or respondents with questions like these. We want to see what you conclude from the numerical data that we're showing you. And what these numerical data are about is about a large study that was focused on gun control. And in particular, does banning handguns in a city cause the crime rate to go down? Or does it have the reverse effect and the crime rate goes up? Now, what the researchers have done is, over the past few years, they've looked at 4 different circumstances. The first thing they've done is they've looked at cities that ban the carrying of handguns in public. That's the top line. And they've looked at cities that have not instituted a ban. So basically what you have are cities that have instituted gun control versus cities that are, for lack of a better term, control condition cities. And what the researchers then did was look to see, was there a decrease in crime or an increase in crime? And they just counted up the number of cities, for example, that banned handguns and experienced a decrease in crime, or banned handguns and got an increase in crime, or didn't do anything and did see a decrease in crime, or didn't do anything and saw an increase in crime. And now the question we ask you, subject or respondent, is if you take a look at these data, does it suggest that banning handguns actually helps to decrease crime? Does it increase the rate at which cities experience a decrease in crime? What say you? Is banning handguns effective in reducing the crime rate? Now, if you are a numerate individual, if you know the statistical manner with which you're supposed to puzzle out in this problem and come to a conclusion, you recognize that really what you need to do is you have to take a look at all the cities that banned the handguns and experience a decrease in crime. And here it's roughly 75%. And compare it to the cities that didn't do anything, yet experienced a decrease in crime. And here, that percentage is 84%. And what you have to conclude is that banning handguns doesn't work. If anything, it actually reverses everything. It actually causes cities to be more likely to experience increase in crime. It is ineffective. And between the choice that handguns are effective, they cause a decrease in crime, or handguns are ineffective, they actually, if anything, are associated with an increase in crime, the correct answer is to say that in these data, the evidence suggests that banning handguns actually makes things worse. That's the conclusion that you get from this data if you're doing that analysis, which is the proper analysis. Basically coming up with the conditional probabilities and ask, what's the chance that you get a decrease in the crime rate if you ban handguns versus don't? Now, that's the proper way to address the question. But most people don't know much about doing a conditional probability analysis, and instead usually tend to be rather drawn to this rather large number of 223. That is in cell A. We call this cell A, cell B, cell C, and cell D. And most people will take a look at 223 and say, well, it's fairly obvious. Banning handguns really works. It happened to it. You got to decrease 223 times. And forget that you actually have to take a look at all 4 cells to actually come to a conclusion. That's what most people do. If they're given a question of this type, they make the cell A error, if you will. The question becomes, when will people actually instead come to the correct conclusion, which is the reverse one based on conditional probabilities? And does it depend on a person's politics? That is, are people more likely to see the right answer when it aligns with their political preferences? Now, in 2017, when Dan Kahan and his research team published their first results on this, what they discovered were 2 things. The first thing, and let's see if I actually show it here and see that. If you take a look at the blue lines here, the blue lines represent what liberal respondents responded when they saw the data that you just saw. That is, I showed you a case in which banning handguns actually increases crime, it can actually reverse the numbers and show that it actually is effective and decreases crime. And some of the people were shown that in a numerical case. For people who are liberal, these are the blue lines. They're much more likely to get the correct answer, the one that avoided cell A bias, the one that avoided the usual error that people make, when the answer was something that's rather consistent with a liberal philosophy, namely banning handguns actually is a liberal position in when they actually turned out to be effective in the data, people are much more likely to spot it and endorse that as the correct answer than when the correct answer was the reverse. It was a conservative condition that banning handguns actually increased crime. Now, for conservative respondents, those are those in the red, they were more likely to get the right answer when the right answer aligned with conservative preferences. That is, when the right answer was crime increases after you ban a handgun as opposed to decreases, conservatives were much more likely to get the right answer than when the right answer went against the conservative philosophy. That is, whether or not people got the right answer depended on whether or not it aligned with their political preferences. That was the first finding or the first claim that Kahan came to. The second claim they came to was that not only were people more likely to get the right answer when the right answer aligned with their politics, that was especially true for people who were numerically skilled. People who are not numerically skilled, that's people over here, were less likely to show this partisan preference, if you will, or partisan set of conclusions. And they made the claim that basically what's going on here is this is an example of expressive rationality. That is, when people look at numerical data of this sort, or any sort of complex problem, what they tend to do is they tend to turn on their intelligence, turn on whatever cognitive ability they have, but they don't turn on their cognitive ability necessarily to get to the right answer. They turn on their cognitive ability and their intelligence to get to the answer they prefer. But if you take a look at motivated reasoning, it's easier to do motivated reasoning if you have a lot of reasoning that you can use. You have a lot of numerical skill, for example. That is, those citizens who enjoy above average science comprehension or numerical ability will not face any less incentive to form any sort of partisan consistent beliefs. Indeed, they will face pressure to use their intelligence and reasoning skills to find evidentiary support for identity congruent beliefs, the comprehension of which would likely exceed the capacity of most of their peers. That is, if you take a look at it, what people do with intelligence is not necessarily come to conclusions that are right. They rather come to conclusions that are favorable, that are preferred, or at least that was the argument that they made. Now, two things to tell you about work of this type. The finding that people tend to come to the right answer when it aligns with their political preferences has been replicated again and again and again, and even among professionals. So economists at the World Bank will tend to find an answer in data, like the type of data that I showed you here, if it aligns with their political preferences about what they expect to happen economically. The same for professional politicians in Denmark, for example, and also for the rest of us. The finding that people come to the right answer when it's congenial to their politics is incredibly well replicated. The idea that the smarter you get, the more this happens, that hasn't replicated. Now, mind you, it hasn't gone down. It's not the case that people who are smarter get the right answer more often, and that quashes the partisan preferences that they're showing. Intelligence doesn't seem to do anything. Now, intelligence does do something, or numerical ability does do something. People are more likely to get to the right answer. But the degree of motivated distortion in the conclusions they reach once they take a look at these numbers, that doesn't decrease the more intelligent people get. Now, the reason I mention this is because often, if you ask people who is most likely to show partisan divisive beliefs, like conspiracy theories, that make the other side look really bad and make our side look really good, people will tend to say, and a lot of researchers will tend to say, well, it's all a matter of intelligence. Intelligent people can avoid this. They've got a better handle of reality. It's people who are less cognitively able who are going to fall prey to misreadings of the data or misreadings of the world. What I want to argue today, though, is that if you take a look at the studies I'm going to show you, as well as studies that come from other places, intelligence really doesn't rid people of the layer of motivated reasoning that they're prone to do. It doesn't rid them of the types of politically congenial conclusions that they have a tendency to reach. But why is that the case? Well, let's do a deep dive. And let's do a deep dive in this, what has come to be known as the Kahan effect, or as the moral equivalent of the trolley problem for those in motivated reasoning. What Dan Kahan and his colleagues proposed is that people use their intelligence when it is motivationally convenient to come to the right conclusion, to come to the right analysis. That is, if they're looking at the numbers and the first initial conclusion they come to looks wrong, it isn't going the right way politically, they get smart and they come to the right reasoning and come to the right answer. That's sort of what they're arguing, if you will. I would argue that isn't necessarily what's going on in terms of how people fulfill any sort of motivated function they might have behind their reasoning. Namely, remember the idea for Dan Kahan is that people do expressive rationality. They use their intelligence to come to the right answer when the right answer is favorable to their politics. And what Clint and I decided to do was take a look at a deep dive of, well, that may not necessarily be the only thing that's going on. In fact, in terms of expressive rationality, you could come to two different variants of expressive rationality, and it really matters which variant might be the case. That is, the idea is that people get smart in order to achieve conclusions they favor. Well, is that the case because a threatening outcome causes them to give pause and then to become deeper thinkers in terms of what conclusions they reach? That is, intelligence turns on? Or is it the case that if they see a congenial, happy conclusion, they turn off their expressive rationality? So it's not expressive rationality per se. It's turning it off when a quick look at the data suggests that the world is the way you expected and want it to be. We wanted to take a look at that. But there's also something else that could be going on that could allow people to get the right answer more often. And have it not really depend on how smart they are or how numerically fluent they are. I don't know, well, probably people aren't aware or know, do you know about get-here cases in philosophy? Okay. What a get-here case in philosophy is a situation where a person comes to a right answer, but does so for the wrong reasons. So they're right, but not because they got to the right answer in the right way. They've used reasoning or they used evidence that is false. And the thing I want to tell you, which is undoubtedly true, studies suggest this, is a lot of the students in your classes taking exams and getting high scores got to those right answers through completely false reasoning that has nothing to do with what you taught them in class. Their right answer is a get-here case. They got to the right answer, but through faulty reasoning. It's certainly possible. And we wondered to what extent get-here cases might be what's involved in terms of causing people to come to conclusions that were congenial to their politics. Or it could simply be that we present people these numbers. If you're an MTurk respondent, this is rather noxious. You'd really like to say, I don't know, but the researchers don't give you the chance to say, I don't know. So what the hey, I'll choose the friendly conclusion. That would be congenial acquiescence. Or finally, what's all this stuff about reasoning? People claim things all the time. Why do you think there's reasoning behind it? They're simply expressive responding. That is, people don't think. They just see a conclusion they want to reach. And they kind of go, yes, I'm going to go with that one. They're going to cheerlead for their side, and there's no reasoning involved whatsoever. They're just choosing the thing that's consistent with what they want to say. End of story. And we wanted to see to what extent this distorting people's conclusions toward their politics in this little piece of science communication to what extent it might be due to any of these sorts of mechanisms. It doesn't necessarily have to be people getting smart, it doesn't necessarily have to involve intelligence. Instead, there are a number of different ways that people can get to the right answer through alternative means. So what we did is a study that replicates the Kahan et al. Finding. Namely, we presented people with data like I've shown you here. Shoot, I'm forgetting how many people we had in this study. It was about 300 or 400 or 200
total.
Yeah.
900.
Okay, 900. Excuse me. And what we did is we basically presented numerical information about a study on gun control for half the people. And either the correct answer was that gun control or a gun ban in cities increased crime, the conservative friendly conclusion, or decreased crime, the liberal friendly conclusion. And we also measured people's gun control attitudes, to what extent do they favor or disfavor gun control. Now, half the people got the gun control scenario that I showed you before. Half the people got exactly the same sort of problem, but it wasn't political at all. It was about whether or not a skin cream caused an increase or a decrease in rashes on the part of customers, something without political content. And what we also did is we measured people's numeracy, that is, to what extent are they skilled in solving numerical problems. We also gauged how much cognitive effort they put into the problem. Maybe if people think more, they are more likely to get to the right answer. We wanted to see if people actually showed effort in terms of solving the answer. So Clint had arranged it so you had to click on a mouse to show the various numbers in the 4 cells so we could see how many times people were going through the numbers. And finally, we asked people to describe for us what was the key comparison among all the numbers. And finally convinced them that this was the answer they wanted to get to. That is, did they come up with a rationale that looked like something like a correct rationale for concluding that the right answer was right? Now, this is the full slate of rationales that people could endorse as to why they decided that the answer was that gun bans increase crime or decrease crime. A lot of these are irrelevant, but some of them are very key. Like the first one is the cell A bias. 223 just is so impressive. And then you can go to various comparisons you can have for all the numbers. The one you should, if you're numerate, endorse is you have to compare the ratio 223 to 75 and compare it to the ratio of 107 to 21. That is, you have to do the conditional probabilities. So you look to see to what extent people not only got the right answer, but endorsed the right comparison that they had to make. Now, in this study, what we did find is if you take a look and compare people who are showing high numeracy versus low numeracy, and we gave them the Berlin numeracy scale, in 2 studies that we ran with basically the same structure, what we found is people who were numerate were more likely to get the right answer in whatever we showed them, regardless of whether or not it was politically congenial or not. And not only that, and we're happy about this, people who are numerate were more likely to endorse the right numerical comparison, the right rationale that they should endorse. People who are numerate not only get to the right answer, but they're more likely to get to the right answer, or more likely to endorse the right rationale you should be using to getting to that answer. But here's the interesting thing. Oh, and before we get to the interesting thing, another interesting thing. If you take a look at both studies and take a look at how much the right answer was congenial to the politics that a person had, and this is a scale from 1 to 5, in terms of how much does the right answer align with your either liberal or conservative politics. What we find for the gun control answer, or gun control scenario, is we find that when the right answer aligns with the person's politics, they're more likely to get the right answer than when it contradicts their politics for both studies. In the gun control scenario, that's the blue, but not in the skin rash scenario, which has nothing to do with politics, so that shouldn't be happening whatsoever. So replicating the Kahan effect. But here's the interesting thing. We have the case that a person can get to the right answer and get to it for the right reasons. Or we can have people get to the right answer for wrong reasons. And we can ask which of those cases is the most associated with the person's politics. When people are getting the right answer because it aligns with their politics more often, is that because they've seen the light and they've seen the right rationale and they endorse not only the right answer, but the right rationale? Or are they endorsing something else? And what we find in most studies is if we take a look first at people not only getting the right answer, but endorsing the right rationale for that answer, indicating this is the comparison you really have to make, and it's the right comparison. For both study 1 and study 2, we see no increase as the right answer becomes more congenial to your politics. What does increase are people endorsing the right answer, but endorsing a wrong rationale for that answer, citing some other reason for that answer. In essence, what our data suggests is we're getting people getting the right answer because their politics is because they're doing Gettier reasoning. They're coming to the right answer, but through the wrong reasons. A couple notes that I should make. Here, if we take a look at people being more right when the answer is congenial to their politics, the one thing I definitely want to mention is this doesn't interact with a person's numerical skill at all whatsoever. Not a surprise, a lot of studies have shown nothing, if you will. But I do want to point out that nothing is a very important illusion. It's not the case you become more intelligent, you see a reduction in motivated reasoning. You see nothing. People are more likely, if they're numerically skilled, to get the right answer, but there still is an equal amount of distortion in terms of what they're coming to. The second thing I'd like to point out is this would point out that you would get the Kahn effect, even if it had nothing to do with numerical ability. Because people who are skilled might be better at finding the right answer if they're numerically skilled and the right rationale. But it's also the case that people can get to the right answer through wrong reasoning, which allows the rest of us to come to the conclusions that are consistent with our politics. Okay. And then let me just mention, the other thing that we did in study 2 is we allowed people to say, I don't know. And fewer than 5% to 2% of people basically in whatever group we looked at said, I don't know. People are answering the question. It's not that we're forcing them to answer. So it's not really congenial acquiescence. Rather, it seems to be the case that people are finding some sort of rationale for their answer, whether or not it's the right rationale. Oh, and because I want to get to the second study, I'm going to skip over the splendid and wonderful and incredibly empirically rigorous study that shows that it really is the fact that people are coming up with a rationale for their study, for their conclusion. It's not just expressive responding. Because if you ask people to do a number of these scenarios, it's only in the first initial scenario that you see a distortion due to politics. And as you move along, people tend to adhere to whatever rationale they use for the first scenario and stick with that. People's rationalizations seem to be something that matters to them. And here is that splendid, wonderful study with great graphs. But I want to skip over that because I want to get back to this. And I want to get back to all those people in our work who were endorsing conspiracy theories or misinformation that was politically congenial, but rather fantastical in terms of the claims that they were saying yes to. And what I've suggested from the first study is that intelligence doesn't seem to be the issue. Cognibility doesn't seem to be the issue, but whether or not people are going to fall prey to motivated reasoning or potentially partisan divisive conclusions. Something else has to be in play. This is what study 2 is. It's another test of cognitive ability, but a test of what else might be going on to actually indicate who exactly is falling prey to partisan divisiveness. Now, in this set of studies that I conducted with Carmen Sanchez, what we decided to do was to survey people on conspiracy theories, some that favored Democrats, some that favored Republicans, and then basically see how much endorsement of those theories correlated with cognitive ability, which we measured in 3 different ways, like an IQ test, or the cognitive reflection test. For those of you who know what the cognitive reflection test is, it's another rather popular way of measuring how much people do deliberative thinking when they're coming to questions that are asked of them. If you haven't heard of it, I've got a baseball bat and ball to sell you. And then also we looked to see to what extent people showed evidence of jumping to conclusion with their in their reasoning. This has to do with the fact that at the same time as this work was going on, Carmen and I were doing work on to what extent did people jump to conclusions or wait before they decided on what conclusion they're going to say. We found that people who tend to jump to conclusions fall prey to a lot of different misbeliefs and a lot of different conspiracy theories. So we wanted to take a look at it in this study. But we were thinking maybe this isn't necessarily all that related to belief in conspiracy theories. The other thing we contrasted to it or tested at the same time was how much people were emotionally invested in their politics. That is, some people are Democrats or Republicans, some people are liberal or conservative, but they really don't care about it. It doesn't really cause much of an emotional reaction to them. Other people care deeply. And so we just basically measured to what extent people reported affective reactions to parties, like how much did the Democratic Party make you feel enthused or angry or frustrated or happy, and same with the Republican Party. We asked people to complete feeling thermometers on both parties, the traditional measure. And finally, we did this in the months before the 2018 midterm election. We asked people how they would react emotionally to either the Democrats winning the congressional race, winning the House or the Senate, or the Republicans winning the House or the Senate. How much would it make them feel happy or angry or enthused or whatever? How much would winning or losing that election represent an emotional event? I'm going to skip over that. See that again. And basically, what we wanted to do is ask this question. What was related to endorsement of conspiracy theories? How much of it was a product of intelligence or cognitive ability, and how much of it was due to emotional involvement in the election coming up? So what we did is we asked those questions about the Republican and the Democratic Party. And the first thing we did, and we asked people those 10 conspiracy theory items that you just saw, and basically looked to see what's the relationship between intelligence and endorsements of those conspiracy theories. And what we found when we took a look at intelligence is the following pattern. Intelligence was related to endorsement of conspiracy theories. That is, the extent the person did well on the amens, didn't jump to conclusions, did well on the cognitive reflection task, they endorsed fewer conspiracy theories. But that was true for both conspiracy theories that were favorable to their party and unfavorable to their party. That is, we took a look at the sum of all the conspiracy theories that people endorsed. People who were less cognitively able endorsed the most theories, regardless of whether or not it was favorable to their political side or not. So intelligence, you could say, is related to endorsement of conspiracy theory, but not to partisan division, not to partisan differences. What was related were measures of emotional involvement. That is, we took a look at the difference between endorsing Republican-friendly conspiracy theories and Democratic-friendly conspiracy theories. Intelligence predicted no divisive pattern, but what did predict a divisive pattern or a difference in terms of endorsing the Democratic-friendly versus the Republican-friendly was how emotionally involved people were with the with the election coming up and with the parties involved in that election. And for those of you who want to see that in a visual way, this is the first table I showed you was from study 1. This is from study 2. If you take a look at cognitive ability from low to high, you can see that whether the conspiracy theory is friendly to your side or unfriendly to your side, people with low cognitive ability endorse more of those conspiracy theories relative to people with high cognitive ability. But if you wanted to see a divergence in terms of what people endorsed, something that was more divisive, it was really people with high emotional involvement as opposed to low emotional involvement. That is, it was not necessarily intelligence that mattered. It was how much people care, if you will. I'll quickly might go through that again. But let me just go through a discussion so we can have some summary so we can have some discussion. Basically, if I were to summarize what we've been talking about or what I've been talking about today, it's that you can ask the question of what causes or what is associated with partisan distortions in misbelief, up to and including conspiracy theories. And what the data seem to suggest is that this isn't really a matter of cognitive ability. Whether you're smart or not smart, that doesn't seem to be something that's related to divisive endorsement of partisan beliefs. What is associated, however, is emotional investment. How much do you care? How much does it matter to you which party wins the election, whether or not you're smart or not? Those who are more emotionally invested are more likely to endorse those conspiracy theories that are friendly to their side and derisive of the other side. Now, towards that end, I do want to make 2 notes about this last finding. The first note I want to make is what we're suggesting is if you want a marker for who is going to believe divisive political misbeliefs, up to and including conspiracy theories, the marker you want to look at is emotional involvement. Emotion is in the mix. Emotion matters. People who are emotionally reactive are the ones who are most likely to endorse things in a politically divisive way. However, I do want to note one thing about emotional notes or emotional explanations for any sort of phenomena. They're inadequate. Because what this suggests is people who are emotional about politics are the ones who are most likely to endorse things in a divisive way, but that still leaves the question of what's behind the emotion, what's producing the emotion. And that's something that we can talk about. The second thing I want to mention is that if you take a look at the literature in psychology and political science and elsewhere, whether the literature is about conspiracy theories or whether it's about differences in political opinion, there's often a lot of debate in terms of how big divisive thinking is. Is this something that is only among elites? Is this something with a big effect size? Is this something with a small effect size? I think this work is essential for that, is important for that, because what it suggests is it's not all persons who are going to endorse conspiracy theories or misbeliefs. They have to be emotionally involved, and that's not everybody. And not all political issues bring out emotion. So it has to be constrained in terms of the emotions that matter, in terms of the issues that matter versus issues that people care about, but they don't care. So it does give a sense of at least suggesting that there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity in terms of when you're going to see partisan division in terms of how people read a scientific study or whether or not people are going to endorse a conspiracy theory. Now, let me end there because I'd actually like to hear everybody's questions, and I'm hoping that there are some. Let me stop there. Yes.
I noticed when you were presenting the data about gun control, you only presented data which, if properly analyzed, suggested the conservative interpretation.
That's right. That's one example. There was a counterbalance example where the liberal interpretation was correct.
Yeah, you just didn't discuss it here, but you did study it.
Oh, yeah. It's part of the data. What we then did is basically fold both the conservative favorable scenario and the liberal favorable scenario together. So that's the data that I showed. So the example I showed is favorable to the conservative side, but you can easily, by flipping the labels, make it something that favors the liberal side. And what we get is a symmetrical finding, basically, that it's not both conservatives and liberals, or rather those who favor gun control versus don't favor gun control, show symmetrical patterns in terms of endorsing the conclusion that's favorable to their side when it's right versus the other side. I don't know if that's your question, but
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. So now you framed the talk in terms of kind of truthfulness, how
Yes.
true. Now, I wonder if that formulation could be useful, but typically people worry or care more about persuasiveness or argumentation rather than documentation.
Right.
Because it's very hard to document anything. Now, in scientific papers, we do our best to document something. If that's impossible, use the example. And if that's still impossible, we use argument.
Right.
Now, in this kind of political domain, it's pretty much argumentation more than anything else. Now, if argumentation comes into play, that's persuasiveness, but persuasiveness depends on the audience. Okay. So Republicans or Democrats argue with other similar folks. So now I don't know where I go, but I wonder if you formulate a whole problem in terms of argument rather than truthfulness, that is quality of intelligence. The different implications might arise. I don't know. I mean, it's different. For example,
Right.
effective numeracy or this 2x2 table. It's possible that both Democrats and Republicans thinking, oh yeah, this number is huge. My folks really believe that, even though I know that it's a little bit deficient. You see my point?
Right.
That is, I wonder if new light might be shed if we or you frame this in terms of kind of social interaction involving argumentativeness as a currency rather than truthfulness of various alleged facts.
Well, that's sort of it. That's an interesting take. One way to construe this is that this is a stress test. So that is, there are some arguments that are going to persuade other people more than others, for example. So it's hard to tell who's exactly biased or not, or is this a situation where people should agree or not, or are they allowed to differ? This is a little bit of a stress test, because what if we took it to a realm where there is a numerically correct answer, or a logically correct answer, or a factually correct answer? Would disagreements still arise, for example, in that sort of space? One of the issues of partisan division is we certainly can have different opinions, but as Daniel Moynihan once said, everybody's allowed their opinion, but you're not allowed to your own facts, if you will. That is, fact, logic, even the logic of mathematics should constrain the arguments that we get into, such that we can actually have a civil discourse and come to conclusions about how to move the country ahead, how to move the people ahead, for example. Where this work comes from is the question of, is bias strong enough, though, that it can even cause people to differ in the argument or differ in the civil discussion, in what facts are in play? So it's in that sort of realm or in that sort of context the work is done. So you're absolutely right that people can differ in terms of what they find persuasive or not. But there's always been the idea that there are reality constraints over what we can find persuasive or what we can find plausible. And this suggests that that's not necessarily the case. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the context within what this work and other work by other people has been placed in.
well, I think about it.
Yeah.
Now, one more very quick question. So this numeracy effect, IQ effect,
Yeah.
seemed to me that in the original study, that's 2x2 table.
Mhm.
So if you don't have enough math or arithmetic, you just give up number. That's impossible. But that factor may not come in your series of studies you report because that's about facts, right?
Right.
So number is not involved. Is that possible? That is, first study,
Mhm.
you know, smarter people evidently committed more bias.
In the very first, I mean, Kahan's original study,
Yeah, right.
or at least that's what he portrayed it as. Yeah.
Referring to.
Yeah.
So that study used 2x2 table.
Right.
So basically, people need to construct arguments according to my argument.
Right.
People need to make an argument out of those four numbers. And that could be a very, very challenging task if you have no idea
Right.
to even think about those four numbers. So that if you don't have enough intelligence in math or arithmetic, you just give up. And that might explain the effect of numeracy or something in the past study by Kahn.
That's what I thought. That is often in psychology, you really have to think is the side of the scale I'm concentrating on really where the explanation is. And his explanation where smart people were finding ways to find the smart number or find the right number when it was congenial to them. But I can imagine at the low end of his numeracy scale where a lot of people say, I don't know. And so they're random in their responses. So they show no effect because they can't really answer it. But other people haven't found that. That is, they don't find that numeracy exacerbates this congeniality effect. They don't find that. One or two have found the reverse. Many find, as we did, that it doesn't moderate whatsoever. And maybe an answer to this, I don't know what happened in his original data set, but maybe one answer to this, we find in our own data, which is there's enough in those four numbers for people not to give up. They can find a way to come to an answer. And in fact, they come to an answer and they come to a rationale. And they do it to a degree that really surprises me. Because I know how many students react to math. And I would tend to think that people would react to it by going, I don't know, I'll choose this one. That it would be expressive responding or just would be an acquiescence. I have to give an answer, let me give the friendly one. But we find people coming to a rationale. They can find a lot of different rationales in those four numbers. And they're biased toward finding a rationale that supports the side that aligns with their politics. So that's what we find. But you're absolutely right. That's my analysis of the original Kahan data as well. That it really wasn't what was going on with the smart people. It was going on with the people who where numerical reasoning was more challenging.
The result may depend on how much push you put on the subject to come up with some rationale or argument. So even if you are done, that's a dead word.
Well,
mathematically handicapped.
Well,
you may, if you are given enough incentive, you try to come up with something.
That's right. And what our data seems to suggest is you don't have to come up with much incentive. That's the thing that surprised me, actually, because I expected to see a lot of expressive responding. I didn't care about the math. I knew what answer I liked, and I went with that one. That's what I was expecting. That's, I think, what we were both expecting.
Yeah, I'm just curious, quickly, to clarify that. When you gave them the option to say, I don't know,
Right.
Did you see differences across your control and flow size conditions in terms of how often people made the choice? So it wasn't that when they didn't like or cared more about the issue at hand, they were more motivated to respond. You still, even with skin cream, they want to get the answer.
I would characterize it as we just got really low numbers,
okay,
like 2-3% in any condition. No chance for there being significant differences whatsoever. That is, people went ahead and gave a rationale, and they gave an answer, and then they gave a rationale. Yeah.
This data seems to indicate that we should be testing our political representatives for cognitive ability.
Well, one would hope that our elections would do that.
In the military, we allow enlisted men to test for admission to officer candidates. And it's a series of pre-testing,
Right.
personality tests. And we don't do that with our elected officials. They can be as dumb as a post, and yet we go ahead and elect them.
Well, there is a story to tell with one study that was done in 2008 by, I forget, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, I might have that wrong, where it gave people a 33-item civics test. And the sample of elected officials they had take that test actually scored lower than the general public on the civics test.
There's not a great deal of science education in the preparation for people who aspire to political office.
Right. Well, there, yes. Yeah.
The two slides from this presentation that resonated with me were the timeline of greater percentage of people viewing the opposite party as like was like a inanimate threat or
Yeah.
you know, basically vilification of the other side. And the idea of the impact of emotional investment. And I mean, looking at that and just what I see around me, it strikes me that politicians have discovered that that the magic of the emotional investment.
Yeah.
And there are so many layers to how this is made worse by a lack of access to factual information that is less emotional. What kind of conclusions do you draw in terms of how we tease that out? I guess I don't know if I'm asking a question exactly, but it's how did I guess my question is, how did you inquire of your subjects their emotional investment? How did you measure that? Because what I see is a lot of sort of intentional exploitation of that in convincing people to be fearful and vilifying. I mean, this is
Right.
It's not like accidentally happened. It's
That's right.
part of the plan. So
Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious, what kind of questions did you ask to measure that temperature? And maybe it was too in the weeds or a different study entirely to inquire what motivated that emotional investment, whether it was like fear or a sense of belonging and being associated with something positive versus fighting something negative or.
Right. Specifically what we asked is we basically asked, okay, we took questions from Gallup, from Pew, and from other places about emotional reactions of the Democratic and Republican Party. How do they make you feel? And, you know, angry, enthused, and so forth. We didn't want to, when we didn't have to, create our own questions. We wanted to borrow what was out there. We also borrowed the feeling thermometer for the Republican and the Democratic Party. The one thing we did, and because it was coming up, was how would you react if the Democrats won the House or the Democrats won the House or won the Senate? How would that make you feel? Same for the Republicans. The Republicans retained the House or retained the Senate. And then we didn't want to pick and choose among our emotional measures, so we put them all together, if you will. Now, I don't have an answer to your question about what do we do, but I do know the next set of questions that we would have to ask if we cared. That is, when I talk, especially to a lot of psychological theorists, they really talk about, if this is all about information, this is all about knowledge, this is all about intelligence, this is all about reasoning ability. Those are the things that you really have to focus in on if you want to forestall political division. And this work suggests to me the beginning of a thought that it's not about the intellectual side of things. It's not the head, it's the heart. You really have to now ask the question that I mentioned at the end, which is, okay, it's emotional involvement that matters. And that's not a surprise. I mean, in the study I skipped over, we studied affirmation emotions and distance emotions. If you really want the Democrats to win, them losing is going to create a lot of distance. That seems to be at play. The question is, okay, what's producing that potential distance? What is it about that person? Is it self-identity? Is it some sort of belief about financial gain or loss? Is it yay team? What is it that, and how many of these things are behind that emotion? And that gives you sort of the arena to look at in terms of not conspiracy theories or misbelief in general, but ones that cause division. That's what the work seems to suggest. So I don't have an answer, but I sort of know where to look next. or where I would like to look next. Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm like similarly interested in the emotional thing. So the classic Michigan political science answer is like, okay, well, this is a story about party ID, like partisanship. And like, if you're a strong partisan, you're going to be highly emotional about your party. So you're gonna tick all the boxes for this high emotionality index. And emotionality is in some sense like a proxy for identification.
Except, except if you ask the straight ahead partisanship question, these effects work beyond partisanship, the straight ahead partisanship question. Go ahead.
So I guess like I was gonna, so exactly like, so did you ask about just party ID?
Yeah.
And to what extent is the emotionality index correlated with party ID? And then relatedly, like, isn't there a kind of contradiction, like, because that seems expressive to me, but the first set of studies, we ruled out expressive, and I forget exactly why. So why are we ruling out expressive in the first set of studies, and isn't this second set?
Okay, I'm going to, I think I heard two questions. I'm going to give you two answers.
Okay.
Which is, you would be surprised, there was a correlation between partisan extremity and emotionality, but you'd be surprised how low that correlation was. That's the thing that's another surprise that came out of this. And we're borrowing other people's questions. In terms of expressiveness, I still think we're in the realm of expressiveness in the first set of studies. But now, if I can put terms in, we're really talking about what is the expressiveness applied to. Expressive rationality. People get smart in order to get to the right answer when it's favorable. People aren't getting smart. So it's not rationality. Expressive responding. We find in the study that I skipped that people seem to adhere more to the rationale they come up with than the conclusions that they're reaching if they do more than one scenario. So it's not expressive responding, because if it were expressive responding, people would just throw away rationales and just go with what's politically congenial. It's not expressive acquiescence, which is, I don't know, let me guess. We don't find evidence of guessing. The term we came up with was expressive rationalization. That is, there's a conclusion you want to get to. Now, can I find a rationalization or an argument that would allow me to come to that conclusion? It doesn't have to be the right one. So what's happening is people are engaged in expressive activity, but it's rationalization as opposed to becoming rational or just merely responding.
Right.
If that'd be the quick way to rattle off to answer your question about the expressive nature of what's going on. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that there is some suggestion that evidence is evaluated in the same way by the same processes that you described. Some work that I and several others have done uses survey-based experiments in which we show people a graphic of a poll result, which a majority holds the same view that they do or the opposite view. And then we ask them how accurate and reliable and trustworthy that poll is. And depending upon their view on the policy, or if it's a political poll, a pre-election poll, whether they support one or the other candidate, if the results are counter to their own beliefs, then they think the poll is less accurate. So the results, I think, are relevant in many domains.
Yeah.
And then the other point, the other comment I make is that there are some data available publicly from the comparative campaign election study, in which they measure these reactions to polls on policy candidates, but they also measure, I think, expressive concerns. How would you feel if the party that you favor lost the election? So they would be available, I think, for secondary analysis by students who are interested.
Especially to try to pinpoint, because once again, an emotional explanation or implicating emotion is just a way station. It tells you, here's the marker, now you have to go and find out what's causing the emotion, and that could be quite helpful in that. I'm not surprised that people, if a survey presents a result that is counter to their expectation or desire, they decide the poll is is worse. Students are doing that to my tests all the time in my class. And there are some who would argue that that's rational. That's a Bayesian, that's a perfectly rational Bayesian response. And there are other Bayesians who say that's apostasy, but that's another story. I do know how you stop that, you prevent that, is if you ask people before they find out the result, how good they think the poll is. You blunt any dismissal of it if it's going to come back with hostile findings, for example. Not in terms of politics, but in other places, we've shown that if we want people to accept the results of an emotional intelligence test, we ask them to rate the test before we tell them how well they did or how poorly they did on it. The trick is you have to anticipate every single possible objection they can come up with. But I'd love to know more about that research. Actually,
Difficult circumstance in a real political campaign.
oh yeah, exactly.
One of the candidates is arguing about skewed polls or fake news.
Right. Oh, it's more difficult. That's one way in which experiments are easy. You can make sure that people do their judgments in the right order, but the real world is a little bit more wild. Yes.
One of the variables that I see in political communication research, and I've used it as a control, is political interest.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask if this might be a matter of kind of, I guess, nonlinear effects of political interest, where one's interest in politics has, sort of increasing and then diminishing returns, and that explains a lot of how they might respond to facts or information.
That may happen because basically the conceptual variable we ultimately alighted on was emotional involvement, and that could be nonlinear as well as linear, or it could be related to something else like are you an activist or not? And those are things we haven't explored.
Yeah, I don't know if the interest has that emotional, like it seems to have some overlap there.
Oh, it could very well be.
It seems, I mean, maybe I need to look more deeply. It just seems to get controlled for a lot. Like, oh, we need to account for this.
Mhm.
And now it seems like maybe we need to look at how it functions in ways that we haven't anticipated, at least now, today.
Well, I'd be interested in how interest is measured, because there's a way in which it can be asked about intellectually versus emotionally.
The one common way is just, I'm interested in politics. The interior, it's pretty standard, not ideal, but.
Interesting. Yes. Oh, yes. Oh.
Way back there.
Yes, you.
So I'm curious about your thoughts on the implications of your studies in terms of how to mitigate the partisan divide on basic facts. Would it be like encouraging people to be less emotional and think more like carefully, or spend more time thinking about these things, statistics, or facts, evidence? What would be your thoughts on that?
There has been some success, but the interventions have been light touch out of the MIT group, David Rand and so forth, is that you really ask or push people to think about things or exhort them to be accurate. You do get people paying more attention to accuracy and giving you more accurate responding, if you will. Now, but that's about conspiracy theories or misinformation in general. I don't know about the divisive nature of it. That could be more related to emotion. That I don't think he's tested, for example. I should mention that in this work on emotional involvement, we tried to get people to be more emotionally distant from their politics. We tried to do Ethan Kross type stuff. I mean, which Ethan were actually here. And we found we couldn't do it. That is, Ethan Kross does work on how, if you get people to emotionally distance from a situation, does judgment or do circumstances improve? We tried everything. We couldn't get people to be emotionally distant from anything that touched upon politics, even if it was a completely novel situation. it's still about Democrats and Republicans, and we couldn't get them to distance. So other than giving them wonderful drugs that are associated with surgery that make you not have a care in the world while they operate on your body, I don't know what intervention might work. But what we've tried and what we found is we couldn't get people to distance. So I had to do something more esoteric to really explore emotions. Yeah.
David, thank you. You give us a lot of stuff to think about. I appreciate that. I was wondering, would you be willing to speculate beyond your experiments? That would there be a cumulative effect? Now take your gun control. If now you could have presented the people with 3 or 4 studies with essentially similar results,
right?
Would that alter their thinking? And the reason I'm thinking is that in the public press, we keep coming up with additional studies. Look at how many studies there were on COVID vaccines. I'm wondering if people's resistance is affected by the amount of information or the frequency of information.
If you're a Bayesian, the answer has to be yes. Now, the problem is, let's say you're doing some sort of a non-Bayesian motivated distortion of facts as they fly from your computer off your TV screen or whatever. One of the understudied possibilities about motivated reasoning, I think that hasn't been looked at yet, but has to be important, is we come to our fantastical conclusions not in one big swoop, but slowly over multiple episodes at a time, so that we distort our impression of some fact or some argument that's been said in a motivated way. That presets us to move even further when we encounter the next fact that's presented along the way, then the next fact that's along the way, then the next, and then we've traveled quite a road. That is, with repeated information, if we have a motivated clause in terms of the reasoning we have, and many opportunities to exercise that motivated reasoning, we don't have to make many motivated moves over time to finally get to a conclusion that's just quite at variance with reality, if you will. So that would be my thinking. That, and this is something I've always wanted to study, is how much of motivated reasoning is just little small steps over time. One of the things I often wondered is in the old days, used to study a lot of college sophomores, and college sophomores show a lot of motivated conclusions about themselves. And I wondered how much of that was not happening in my lab, but had been happening since they were little kids, that finally made them ultimately have incredibly rosy views about themselves. And you could speculate, okay, I'm now 40 years on. I wonder how much I've done that to myself. But so what can happen is motivated reasoning may occur, and it occurs without our awareness, because it's just a series of small steps over time that we do whenever we are thinking about an issue again and again and again. I don't know if that answers your question.
So thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Michaela.
Yes, so thank you for a great talk. While listening, I was thinking a lot about people who are emotionally invested in politics, but they just hate both sides. They're just fed up with all of this. They hate the Democratic Party, they hate the Republican Party. And I'm curious, either if you found anything on this kind of subgroup or just speculation, would they display biases in a similar way, like both sides are wrong, or are they more likely to get to the correct answer in these tasks? I'm just curious how that group would operate.
Well, the answer is I don't know, but one could delve back into the data and take a look, because if those people I think they certainly exist. They exist in my family. We should have data that should identify them, and then we can see what they're doing.
That'd be really cool.
Yeah, because we just looked at the difference between how favorably did you look at the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party. But we didn't look at the overall, do you like both sides or hate both sides? But there may be an answer in those data, so I'll take a peek.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just a layperson, I think I understood you're saying that emotional investment drives people to believe conspiracy theories.
Well, I have to say it is associated with belief in divisive conspiracy theories. I can't claim causality.
That's fair. My intuitive experience of the world is the reverse, that conspiracy theories are are associated with what emotion
Yeah.
and drawing people in. Is that true? And also, you started to talk about how polarization has become more emotional. Did you say why you thought that's the case?
Oh, I'm sure there are experts in the room who know better than I do. It's just that the distinction in political science is between ideological polarization. What do you think about policies? Versus affective polarization. So what do you think about your side versus your team versus the other team, if you will, and attach emotion to that. Affection for your side and hatred toward the other side. And it's just that, and anybody can always stop me when I overstep or get wrong. The data suggests that in the past 30 years or so, people are much more, show much more affect in their polarization, usually expressed as hatred of the other side. This is approximate. So around 1960, maybe 5% of Democrats and Republicans would say they wouldn't want their kid to marry someone from the other party. Now it's around 36%. That's affective polarization. Those are not the exact figures, but that's the type of phenomenon we're talking about. I saw Shinobu look like you.
Oh, yeah, well, actually, I was going to ask a similar question. So, motivate the reasoning recognition.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask you this connection between this collective change, cultural change, and potential role of motivated reasoning. That is, or this is psychological, that has nothing to do with this longer term cultural change.
Well, I mean, we measured emotional involvement in various ways. And what's behind the emotional involvement? Well, there are limits to what we know. But the one thing that I passed over is if you take a look at motivated reasoning, it itself is connected to emotional involvement. So one of the reasons we did that 2018 study is we were interested in using the 2018 study as a test for motivated reasoning. So what we did 2 waves of this. Both studies showed the same thing. Is we got Republicans and Democrats to basically we asked them to guess what the likelihood was that the Democrats and Republicans would win the House in 2018, and the Democrats and Republicans would win the Senate in the 2018 election. And then we were in a happy circumstance because assuming, and we historically elections are 50-50, and people given us an estimate of how much their side or the other side was going to win, both the House and the Senate, we could then present them truthfully data from 538.com of its estimate of the likelihood that the Democrats would win the House or the Republicans would retain the House, and the same for the Senate. And we could truthfully say, look, 538 has done all this work, but it's explained, and they say there's a 68% chance the Democrats are going to take the House, and they did. And there's a 75% chance the Republicans will retain the House, retain the Senate, and they did. We just tell you this. Do you want to revise the estimate you gave before about whether the Republicans or the Democrats are going to win either House of Congress? Now, what we could do, based on their previous estimate, the fact that the parties are pretty close to 50-50 in terms of winning both houses of Congress, and their new estimate, we could see to what extent we saw motivated reasoning in the revision of the estimate that people saw. So you're a Democrat, you're told there's a 68% chance that the Democrats are going to win the House. Are you more likely to shift your estimate than a Republican would, hearing the same news? And if you're a Democrat and you hear there's a 75% chance the Republicans are going to retain the Senate, you shift less relative to how much a Republican is going to shift. This is a rather common paradigm in motivated reasoning. It's just basically how much do people shift their beliefs relative to how much a Bayesian says they should shift their beliefs. Now, if you take a look at this graph, this is the House story. And an upward shift means that the person thinks there's more of a chance upon reflection, upon hearing the 538.com news, that the Democrats are going to win the House. If you take a look, Democrats are more likely to or shift more than Republicans do. Yes, we've done all the various controls, blah, 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 blah. But basically, compared to how much they should shift, Democrats are shifting more than Republicans. Or rather, nobody's shifting as much as they should, but Democrats are shifting more. This is particularly true, in fact, it's almost only true of people with high emotional involvement. On the Senate side, downward shifts mean a shift toward believing Republicans are more likely to retain the Senate. If you take a look, Republicans shift more in a Republican direction than Democrats do, but it's only the high emotional investment people who are showing the partisan pattern of shifts. People who don't care don't show a partisan difference in terms of how much they're shifting, or they're updating their beliefs based on good news or bad news. So I forgot what your question was, but I thought that answered it. Does that answer your question? Because I forgot what your question was.
Yeah, well, I'm sure something like this is involved. And one issue obviously is kind of causality.
Yeah.
Where emotions might be coming from.
Exactly. That's
It seemed to me that, I don't know, I'm just thinking aloud. Just where about half the population is exposed to CNN, hearing lots of arguments.
Right.
The remaining half are exposed to Fox and hearing lots of arguments, and also appropriate emotions too. So that kind of social change might be behind this phenomenon.
No, I think that's right. That is, the extent that you're tugging at people's emotions, you are potentially putting them in a situation where they're potentially going to engage in more motivated reasoning. Because the argument here is that motivated reasoning is not about the reasoning, it's about the motivation, it's about the emotion. And it's certainly not about either political sophistication, which we've measured, or about IQ, which we've measured. That doesn't moderate any of this. It's emotional involvement that's moderating how much partisan motivated reasoning we see going on in this study. So whatever is producing the emotion is the things. And it could be the news, it could be our neighbors, it could be Twitter, I don't know. But that's one conclusion you could potentially explore. Yes?
Since you measured the IQ and you measured party affiliation, what does that tell you? Who's smarter?
Oh. There's no difference. Historically, there isn't a difference. I mean, we can talk about differences in education, and that's obviously changing. I refer you to the talk that was given in this room 2 weeks ago, but we're not doing representative samples in this work. Though we do lean heavily on the findings from representative samples of other people's work. So I don't know. I can't make a call. Now, if you buy me a couple martinis.
I recall from my time in the Army, they had it when I was during Vietnam. They had the total enlistment plan. So you come into the Army and you couldn't read or write. They give you 6 months to learn, and nobody did.
Really?
Very, very low turnout. If they did turn them out, they became truck drivers, and that was as far as they could go.
Interesting. Oh, that's interesting.
And they discovered that if a person had an IQ roughly below 80, there was nothing they could train them to do to make them worthwhile keep them in the military.
Those were the smart ones.
Yeah.
They didn't give a name.
Yeah, you could avoid me, but I
hadn't thought about that as an implication. Okay, well, it's 5 o'clock. I think it's the witching hour. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the questions. Take care. Have a happy Valentine's Day and beyond.